One of the biggest mistakes people make when trying to understand and avoid it is assuming that distance always means the same thing. Most people see withdrawal and immediately conclude that the feelings are gone. They assume silence equals indifference, that a lack of communication equals a lack of care. But human psychology is rarely that simple, and when it comes to avoidant individuals, surface behavior can often hide a much deeper internal reality. You see, when an avoidant truly reaches a place of emotional detachment, something interesting happens. Their behavior becomes remarkably stable. There is no emotional turbulence beneath the surface. There is no internal tug-of-war. They are not spending energy managing feelings because the emotional charge has largely disappeared. Their distance feels calm, consistent, and predictable. Whether days pass, weeks pass, or even months pass, their actions remain relatively unchanged because there is no unresolved emotional conflict driving them. But when they still care, everything begins to look different. The distance remains, but it loses its stability. Instead of feeling calm, it starts feeling restless. Instead of being consistent, it becomes unpredictable. You begin to notice subtle contradictions. One moment they seem completely unavailable, emotionally shut down, almost as though they've moved on entirely. Then suddenly, without explanation, they appear again. Maybe it's a brief message. Maybe it's a small reaction. Maybe it's an unexpected reminder that they're still paying attention. To the outside observer, this behavior can feel confusing, but psychologically, it makes perfect sense. An avoidant who no longer cares has no reason to struggle internally. An avoidant who still cares is constantly managing opposing forces. One part of them is seeking emotional safety through distance. Another part is still emotionally connected to the person they're trying to create distance from. That internal conflict creates inconsistency. And inconsistency is often one of the strongest signs that emotions are still active beneath the surface. Think about it for a moment. Human beings become conflicted only when something matters. We don't spend emotional energy wrestling with things that hold no significance. Internal struggle is evidence of emotional investment. The mind only creates resistance when there is something meaningful pushing against it. This is why avoidants often appear to move closer and farther away at the same time. They may delay responding, not because they have nothing to say, but because responding forces them to engage with feelings they've been trying to suppress. They may disappear after moments of closeness, not because the connection meant nothing, but because it meant more than they felt comfortable handling. The very emotions they desire can become the emotions they instinctively retreat from. And this creates a paradox that many people misunderstand. The deeper the emotional significance becomes, the stronger the urge to create distance can become. To someone with a secure emotional framework, closeness creates comfort. To someone operating through avoidance, closeness can create vulnerability. And vulnerability activates fear. Not necessarily fear of the other person, but fear of dependence, fear of losing control, fear of emotional exposure. So they withdraw. But here's the critical insight. Withdrawal does not automatically eliminate attachment. Distance can separate people physically, but it does not instantly erase emotional significance. In fact, unresolved emotions often continue operating beneath the surface long after external contact has been reduced. The avoidant may successfully create space, but they often discover that creating space and creating emotional freedom are not the same thing. This is why their behavior begins carrying emotional weight. Their silence feels different. Their absence feels different. There is a tension beneath it that wasn't there before. You can sense that something remains unresolved, even if it has never been spoken aloud. And over time, maintaining that emotional distance becomes increasingly exhausting, because every act of withdrawal requires effort when the attachment itself is still alive. The mind can suppress awareness, but it cannot permanently silence what the heart continues to feel. That is when the first cracks begin to appear. Not because they planned for them to appear. Not because they suddenly changed their mind. But because genuine emotion has a way of revealing itself when someone spends too long trying to hide from it. And that's the truth most people miss. When distance becomes inconsistent, the issue is often no longer a lack of feeling, it is a struggle with feeling too much. Before an avoidant is willing to move toward emotional honesty, there is often a stage that many people completely overlook. It's not marked by dramatic conversations, emotional confessions, or obvious attempts to reconnect. In fact, if you're only paying attention to direct communication, you may miss it entirely. Because one of the clearest signs that an avoidant can no longer pretend they don't care is that they begin watching from a distance more than ever before. Now, this is where understanding avoidant psychology becomes incredibly important. Most people assume that attention and engagement are the same thing. They believe that if someone cares, they will reach out. If someone is interested, they will communicate. If someone misses you, they will tell you. But avoidants often operate differently. Their emotional world is not organized around expression. It is organized around management. When feelings become intense, their first instinct is rarely to move closer. Their instinct is to create enough distance to regain a sense of control. The problem is that emotional attachment doesn't simply disappear because they have stepped back. The connection often remains active beneath the surface, even while they are trying to convince themselves that distance is the right choice. And this is where observation begins. Instead of participating, they watch. Instead of expressing, they monitor. Instead of engaging directly, they stay connected indirectly. They may check your social media without ever leaving evidence that they were there. They may notice changes in your life without mentioning them. They may remember details about your experiences, your routines, your successes, and your struggles, despite acting as though they are uninvolved. To an outside observer, this can seem contradictory, and that's because it is. If they truly didn't care, there would be no reason to invest attention. Attention is one of the most valuable forms of energy a human being possesses. We naturally direct it toward what matters to us. We return to what carries emotional significance. We remain aware of what still occupies space in our minds. The avoidant man. Don't be consciously saying, "I miss this person." They may not even allow themselves to think those exact words. But their attention often reveals what their defenses are trying to conceal. Psychologically, watching from a distance serves a very specific purpose. It allows them to maintain a connection without exposing themselves to vulnerability. They get to feel close without risking rejection. They get to stay informed without becoming emotionally accountable. They get to experience your presence while avoiding the discomfort that direct engagement might create. From their perspective, it feels safer. But safety comes with a cost. Because every time they check, every time they observe, every time they quietly reconnect to your existence, they reinforce the emotional bond they are attempting to keep at a distance. This creates a fascinating internal contradiction. The very behavior they use to avoid confronting their feelings often keeps those feelings alive. Think about the hat. Every glance becomes a reminder. Every update becomes emotional information. Every observation becomes another thread connecting them to a relationship they may be trying to move beyond. And over time, those threads accumulate. What starts as occasional curiosity can become habitual attention. What begins as a brief check-in can become a pattern of emotional monitoring. Without realizing it, they remain psychologically connected to the very thing they claim to be distancing themselves from. This is why avoidance can sometimes appear detached externally while remaining deeply engaged internally. The outside behavior tells one story. The inner experience tells another. And the gap between those two realities becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. What makes this stage so important is that it reveals something fundamental about human nature. We can suppress expression. We can suppress communication. We can even suppress awareness for a period of time. But sustained attention, is difficult to fake. Attention follows significance. It follows meaning. It follows emotional investment. When someone repeatedly returns their awareness to your life despite maintaining physical or emotional distance, it often signals that the connection has not been fully resolved within them. The feelings may be unspoken. The attachment may be unacknowledged. The conflict may remain hidden. But their attention continues telling the truth. And eventually that truth becomes harder and harder to ignore. After a period of watching from a distance, something even more significant begins to happen. The dynamic starts to change, not because the avoidant suddenly becomes more emotionally expressive, and not because someone finally says the perfect words. The shift happens because the person on the other side stops carrying the emotional weight of the connection alone. This is the moment many people underestimate. Most individuals who become emotionally attached to an avoider, eventually fall into a predictable pattern. They try harder, they explain more, they seek reassurance, they reach out repeatedly, they attempt to create clarity where there is uncertainty. And while these actions often come from a sincere desire for connection, they can also create a dynamic where one person becomes responsible for maintaining the entire emotional bridge. For a while, the avoidant may become accustomed to this, not necessarily in a manipulative way, not because they consciously expect it, but because human beings naturally adapt to whatever becomes familiar. If someone is always available, always reaching out, always keeping the connection alive, that availability can become part of the emotional environment. And then something changes. The pursuit stops. The explanations stop. The constant efforts to hold everything together stop. Suddenly, the emotional landscape is no longer the same. At first, the avoidant may appear completely unaffected. In fact, this is often where people become confused. They expect an immediate reaction. They expect dramatic outreach, emotional declarations, or obvious signs of concern. But avoidant psychology rarely works that way. Their first response is often silence, not because nothing is happening, because something is happening. Internally, they are adjusting to a reality they did not anticipate. For perhaps the first time in a long time, they are no longer responding to your pursuit. They are responding to your absence of pursuit. And that creates a completely different psychological experience. You see, emotional distance often feels safe when there is an assumption that the connection remains available. As long as someone is still emotionally invested, still waiting, still reaching, the avoidant can maintain distance without fully confronting the possibility of loss. But when you genuinely step back and redirect your energy toward your own life, that assumption begins to disappear. What once LT permanent now feels uncertain, and uncertainty has a remarkable ability to expose hidden emotions. Human psychology is deeply influenced by perceived availability. We often do not fully recognize the value of something when we assume it will always remain within reach. But the moment access becomes uncertain, awareness intensifies. Suddenly, questions begin to surface. What if they are moving on? What if they no longer need me? What if the connection is changing in ways I cannot control? These questions are not always conscious. The avoidant may never sit down and deliberately analyze them. Instead, they often emerge as subtle restlessness, unexpected curiosity, or an increasing awareness of your absence. This is where emotional independence becomes so powerful, not because it forces someone to return, not because it manipulates their emotions, but because it removes the distraction that allowed them to avoid confronting their own feelings. When you stop chasing, you stow. Providing constant reassurance that the connection will remain intact regardless of their behavior. The emotional focus shifts back to them. They are left alone with their own thoughts, their own reactions, and their own unresolved attachment. And that can be deeply uncomfortable, because now the issue is no longer your efforts. The issue is their feelings. For many avoidants, this becomes a turning point. They begin noticing your absence in places where they once noticed your presence. They become aware of the emotional space you occupied. They recognize that your attention, your energy, and your availability were never guaranteed resources. And perhaps most importantly, they begin seeing you differently. No longer as someone waiting for them, no longer as someone trying to convince them, but as someone capable of moving forward independently. That realization carries tremendous psychological weight, because independence changes the emotional equation. It transforms the company. Connection from something assumed into something that can genuinely be lost. And loss has a way of revealing what attachment was trying to hide. This is why your growth matters so much. Not because it changes them, but because it changes you. When your emotional well-being no longer depends on their responses, you reclaim your power. You stop living in reaction and start living with intention. And that is the paradox at the center of every healthy relationship dynamic. The moment you stop trying to control the connection is often the moment you see it most clearly. Once that shift begins to happen, once your emotional independence starts changing the dynamic, another pattern often emerges. And this is where many people become confused because they expect emotional realization to look dramatic. They imagine that when an avoidant can no longer deny their feelings, they will suddenly become completely open, vulnerable, and direct. But in reality, emotional breakthroughs rarely happen that way. Especially for someone whose entire coping strategy has been built around emotional control. When an avoidant begins feeling the weight of unresolved attachment more strongly, they often do not rush forward with grand declarations. They move in much smaller ways. Their emotional system is still trying to balance two competing forces. One part of them wants connection. Another part still fears the vulnerability that connection requires. As a result, their attempts to reconnect often arrive in fragments: a short message, a casual question, a reaction to something you shared, an unexpected appearance after a long period of silence. On the surface, these actions can seem insignificant. In fact, many people dismiss them because they do not match the emotional intensity they expected. They think, if they truly cared, wouldn't they say more? Wouldn't they do more? But that perspective overlooks the psychological reality of avoidance. For an avoidant, small actions can prevent enormous internal movement. What looks minor externally may have required significant emotional effort internally. This is important to understand because avoidants rarely communicate from a place of complete certainty. Before taking emotional risks, they often seek information. They observe, they test, they measure the emotional environment. In many ways, these subtle signals function as emotional probes. They are trying to answer questions they may never ask directly. Is the connection still there? Is it safe to engage? Have things changed? Will I be rejected? Do they still care? Because these questions remain unresolved, their behavior often appears cautious and incomplete. They crack the door open rather than throwing it wide open. And that hesitation is not necessarily evidence of a lack of feeling. More often, it is evidence of fear existing alongside feeling. This distinction matters because many people misinterpret inconsistency as indifference. But inconsist, NCY often points toward conflict. A person who feels nothing has little reason to test emotional waters. They simply continue moving forward. The desire to reconnect, even in small ways, usually signals that something remains psychologically active beneath the surface. At the same time, it is important to understand that these small signals are not always conscious strategies. Many avoidants are not sitting alone planning exactly when to reach out or how to create emotional ambiguity. More often, these moments emerge from emotional pressure that has gradually accumulated over time. A memory surfaces. A moment of loneliness appears. A reminder triggers reflection. Curiosity grows stronger than resistance. And suddenly, they act. Not because they have fully resolved their feelings, but because suppressing those feelings has become more difficult than acknowledging them, even briefly. This is why timing often tells a deeper story than the action itself. These signals frequently appear after distance has been established. They emerge after silence, after separation, after emotional space has existed long enough for unresolved feelings to begin resurfacing. Something inside them has been activated. And while they may not be ready to fully explain what that something is, they can no longer completely ignore it either. The challenge for many people receiving these signals is that they want certainty immediately. They want the small gesture to instantly transform into complete clarity. They want a simple message to become a full emotional conversation. But growth rarely unfolds that way. Human beings often move toward difficult truths in stages. And avoidants, perhaps more than most, tend to approach emotional vulnerability gradually. The small signal is not the destination. It is evidence of movement. It is evidence that emotional distance is no longer functioning as perfectly as it once did. It is evidence that something beneath the surface is beginning. To demand attention. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals that emotional attachment has become difficult to keep entirely hidden. Because when someone truly feels nothing, silence is effortless. When someone still feels something, silence eventually becomes heavy. And sooner or later, that emotional weight finds a way to express itself. The lesson here is simple. Do not become obsessed with the size of the gesture. Pay attention to what the gesture represents. Small actions often reveal what words are still afraid to say. And when someone begins reaching out through cracks instead of walls, it may be a sign that the barriers protecting their heart are no longer as strong as they once were. And this brings us to the point where everything we've discussed begins to converge. The emotional inconsistency, the silent observation, the impact of your independence, the small signals and unexpected reappearances. None of these behaviors exist in isolation. They are often symptoms of something much deeper happening beneath the surface. They point toward a moment that every avoidant eventually faces when unresolved feelings can no longer remain comfortably hidden behind distance. For a long time, avoidance can feel effective. Distance creates relief. Silence creates space. Emotional suppression creates the illusion of control. When difficult feelings arise, stepping back appears to solve the problem. Vulnerability is reduced. Emotional intensity is lowered. The avoidant feels protected from the uncertainty that closeness often brings. But there is a fundamental truth about human psychology that cannot be escaped. Feelings that are avoided are not the same as feelings that are resolved. This distinction changes everything. Many people believe that time alone dissolves emotion. Sometimes it does. But when a connection carries genuine significance, time often reveals rather than erases what remains unresolved. Emotions pushed out of conscious awareness have a markable tendency to return in unexpected ways. They reappear through memories, reflections, comparisons, dreams, moments of loneliness, and quiet periods when there are no distractions left to keep them buried. The avoidant may believe they have moved beyond the connection simply because they have stopped talking about it. But the mind keeps records. The emotional system remembers experiences that mattered, and eventually what was suppressed begins asking for attention. At first, the process is subtle. A memory appears unexpectedly. A familiar place triggers reflection. A song, a photograph, a conversation, or even a moment of silence suddenly carries emotional weight. Things that once seemed distant begin feeling strangely present again. This is where the emotional defenses start weakening. Not because the avoidant wants them to weaken, not because they consciously decide to lower their guard, but because maintaining emotional distance requires energy. Suppression is not passive, it is active work. It demands constant effort to keep uncomfortable feelings pushed away from awareness, and over time that effort becomes exhausting. The emotional wall that once felt solid begins developing cracks. What is fascinating is that this stage often creates confusion within the avoidant themselves. They may not understand why certain thoughts keep returning. They may not understand why your absence feels different than they expected. They may not understand why they continue thinking about a connection they believe they had already left behind. The reason is simple. The emotional reality never fully disappeared. It was postponed, and postponed emotions eventually seek expression. This is why distance starts feeling different. What once felt like freedom begins feeling like emptiness. What once felt like control begins feeling like isolation. What once felt like protection begins feeling like disconnection. The strategy that once provided comfort, a dually stops delivering the emotional relief it promised. And when that happens, a profound internal shift begins. For perhaps the first time, they are forced to confront a possibility they spent months, sometimes years, avoiding. What if the problem was never the feeling itself? What if the struggle came from trying to outrun it? Because there is a philosophical truth that applies not only to relationships, but to life itself. Anything we consistently refuse to face gains power over us. The things we resist often continue influencing us from the shadows until we finally acknowledge them directly. The same principle applies to emotional attachment. The more energy someone spends pretending not to care, the more exhausting the performance becomes. Eventually, authenticity becomes easier than avoidance. Not because vulnerability suddenly feels comfortable, but because maintaining emotional distance becomes more painful than telling the truth. This is the moment when the illusion, ion, begins to break. The illusion that distance erased the connection. The illusion that silence eliminated the feeling. The illusion that emotional significance can simply be switched off through willpower alone. And when those illusions collapse, something important is revealed. Beneath all the defenses, beneath all the withdrawal, beneath all the attempts to stay in control, there was still something real. Something that remained alive despite every effort to suppress it. And that realization carries a lesson far beyond avoidant attachment. Life changes the moment we stop running from what we feel and start understanding it. Because the strongest people are not the ones who successfully avoid their emotions. The strongest people are the ones who have the courage to face them, and the feelings we stop fighting often become the very truths that set us free.